Hello, my name is Amanda, and I'd like to present to you a little bit about my PhD research about refugee background students and their transitions into mainstream schooling. So this video will be in three parts. The first part I'll be speaking about, the middle row, about my research and the context, how I got into the research, my theoretical framework and the methodology. The second part will be about what I found, so the raw data and some of the key results that came out of my research. And then in the last video, I'm going to be talking about a bit of a discussion about what the data means for the project, the so what of the findings, and a little bit of recommendations about where we can go from here. So before I begin my presentation, I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as well as the Wathaurong people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, for allowing me to do this presentation to you, but also for allowing me to do my research on their land. I'm very grateful. As I said, my name is Amanda. You can reach me at this email address, and that's a little bit of a list of my publications. Hopefully, also many more forthcoming. So first, a little bit of an overview of how I came into research. I'm actually a secondary teacher of LOTE and EAL, English as an Additional Language. So I was teaching in intensive English language school in the metropolitan area of Melbourne, and I noticed that many of the students who left the school at the end of their allotted timing allowance, which was usually between 6 months and 12 months, would always come back in those first few months after they'd transitioned into mainstream school. And it seemed that they weren't transitioning well because they were having a really tough time in high school or TAFE or wherever they had transitioned to. One of my colleagues told me a story of how she was teaching in the classroom. In 5 minutes, she realized when she looked up, tucked in the back corner of the classroom, was one of her former students from the previous term who was supposed to be at high school. He had on his lovely new high school uniform, which was still a little bit big for him. And he said, "What on earth are you doing here? You're supposed to be at high school, not this language school." And he said that he just was a little bit sad and he wanted to see everybody again and that he wanted to come back to the language school. So that my friend, his teacher, his former teacher, and the whole class gave him a big hug and walked him out of the school and farewelled him to his high school. But to me, that was very symbolic of what was going on, that something wasn't quite right, and I felt like I needed to go back and plunge myself into some research as to why this was going on and how we could help improve the situation. So from that, I came into my research with some key questions that I wanted to answer. Firstly, I wanted to look at what are the experiences of these students as they're transitioning from the intensive English language school into mainstream schooling. And I wanted to focus their voices and their experiences primarily in the research. The second key sub-question of that was looking at perspectives of other key stakeholders of transition. So of course, putting in the forefront the students' voices and experiences, but rounding this out with many different perspectives of what was going on in transition from those who had expert knowledge. And lastly, looking at what was working and what wasn't working in transition for these students, the factors that facilitate and inhibit transition. So there were two key fields of research that informed my research, and so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the literature as a background knowledge. Firstly, refugee background students. Who are they? There's actually a lot of literature, and one of the key authors from England, Jill Rutter, has a lot to say in this area, and she's quite a profound author, so I highly recommend looking into her. And there's also a lot of research into refugee background students in the mainstream schooling context. Now, a lot of that literature does kind of focus on deficit perspectives, so what they're up against and the challenges that teachers and schools face when these new cohorts come into the schools. So for me, the perceived gaps were quite a few, and that's what I wanted to integrate into my research. So firstly, wanting to expand our knowledge base about specific cohorts of students. We've got lots of research on Sudanese students, students from the Horn of Africa, But there's also a lot of new cohorts of refugee background students coming into the mainstream school system that we can expand this knowledge base about. I wanted to focus not on deficit perspectives, but on the successes and the resources that students are bringing into school, and really put in the forefront, as I mentioned before, their experiences and their voices to show that they have agency in this process. And lastly, of course, as a teacher, I wanted to contribute some practical solutions as to how we can improve and support students in their transitions. The other main field of literature is educational transition. So I had to move really broadly out into very generalized transition in education, because at this stage there isn't much, if anything, on transition specifically for refugee background students. So I moved into early childhood to primary setting transitions, for which there is an enormous amount of research and policy and practice resources available. Kay Margetts from the University of Melbourne has contributed with her colleagues to a great deal to this research. And one of the key findings that she and her colleagues found was that for young learners starting primary school or elementary school, it takes until about grade 3 for them to fully transition and feel like they belong, that they have an identity within the school community. And they also came up with a TPS, a transition position statement, which informs policy on how we can better support young learners moving into the mainstream school system. There's also a lot of research for refugee background students about the challenges in accessing mainstream schooling, but not specifically on transition, which is a very different thing for refugee background learners, because they're often moving into mainstream contexts in the middle of the year, in the middle of their schooling, and inherent challenges exist for this particular experience. So some of the gaps that I wanted to fill in my research was looking specifically at secondary education transitions. What are the processes and procedures involved? And transitions for refugee background students specifically? And what is the ideal of transition? So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my theoretical framework. So this is, I've incorporated two different theories, a funds of knowledge theory and also Cummins' coercive and collaborative frameworks theory. So let me talk a little bit about that so you can see how I have framed my research and the perspectives that I'm using to gather my data and to come up with my findings. So firstly, the funds of knowledge theory, formulated by Gonzalez, Moll and Amanti in America, uses this additive perspective about students, and it's focusing on the strengths that they have, their skills, and all of the resources that they bring into the school. Pat Thompson actually came up with another term that's a very similar concept called virtual school bags. So if you can imagine, a student comes into school with their backpack full of books, but they've also got this imaginary backpack where they put all of their previous experiences, their world knowledge, their culture, their previous learnings, their skills, their expertise. All of that comes into their schoolwork, and they're actually coming into school, into the classroom, with so much already that we can utilize in the classroom. So this really, as I mentioned, is an additive perspective, and that allows us as teachers, educators, school leaders to legitimize and build upon these students' resources and capacities. And it also challenges dominant knowledge paradigms and deficit perspectives. The other theory that I base my work on is Jim Cummins from Canada. His theory about coercive frameworks and collaborative frameworks within a school structure. So that's looking at a school as like a mini society and looking at all of the power structures inherent in a school and how that might impact on a student's learning for the better, or for the worse. So firstly, coercive school practices, likely they are inhibiting transition. So that's where dominant groups, so the majority, say in the Australian context, English-speaking teachers, students and school leaders are exercising power, which unfortunately is to the detriment of subordinate groups such as refugee background learners. Whereas when you're looking at collaborative frameworks, which I guess is the ideal, that's looking at school practices inherent in the school that facilitate transition. So that's subordinated minority groups such as the refugee background students, who then become empowered through this collaborative creation of power. So that would be the ideal. And looking at, as I was researching transition, in what ways are these coercive and collaborative school practices happening for the students, and what was their impact on transition and their outcomes at school? So a little bit about my methodology. Firstly, there were 3 phases in transition for the students. The first phase was their last term at the English language school. The second phase was the first term in their new mainstream school, and the third phase was their second term in the mainstream school. So I followed them for a whole year, actually 4 terms. The first term was like a pilot program, and it's a longitudinal ethnographic case study. So I collected different types of data, such as interviews with students and families and other key stakeholders. I collected their work samples. I did lots of observations, not just in class time, but in recess lunchtime and also in their homes. And I also collected visual images. I wanted something quite unique, and this allowed me to use an arts-based method, which was very powerful in terms of gathering a kind of data from the students that allowed them to voice their experiences and their feelings and their thoughts in a way that perhaps language, even if it was their first language, that they weren't able to. And using this number of methods also allowed me to triangulate or crystallize the methods, the data, also my findings. So who was involved in the research? Firstly, my student participants. There were 7 Karen background refugee learners who had newly arrived to Australia. The Karen are an ethnic minority from Burma who have been persecuted for about 60 years, and so they fled into refugee camps on the Thai-Burma border. This is a picture of their refugee camp, which I took myself because I visited Mela refugee camp, and you can see the living situation. They do have schools, but a lot of the schooling is quite interrupted and not quite as rigorous as the Australian education system. I also interviewed and involved the students' families, all of their teachers at all of the schools they attended, transition officers from the English language school and regional officers, and community experts involved in transition. There were 5 schools involved in my study. Firstly, the English language school, from which all 7 students came from. And then when they transitioned, they went into 4 different schools. So we had 1 TAFE and 3 secondary schools or high schools. So that's a little bit of an overview of the context of my research. The next thing I'll be speaking about in part 2 will be the data and the results. What came of all of this?